Welcome, and thank you for being here. This is your time to slow down, to release the weight of the day. Make yourself comfortable. Settle into bed. Rest your head on your pillow. And if you can, lower the lights until the room feels calm and quiet. Before we begin, I'd love to ask you a small favor. When you have a moment, please write in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. I'm always so curious to see how far these videos can reach, and it makes me feel connected to each of you. If this video helps you rest, please remember to like and subscribe. It's a small gesture, but it truly helps the video find others who might also need comfort and sleep tonight. My wish is simple, that you won't make it to the end because your body will relax, your mind will soften, and sleep will gently take over long before we finish. And if you ever have ideas for future topics, please let me know in the comments. I want this channel to be a place built for you. So, take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and let's begin together. When we speak of the harem, our minds often drift to the gilded halls of the Ottoman palace, with its silken cushions and echoing chambers. Yet, the harem did not begin there. It is far older, stretching back thousands of years, to some of the earliest kingdoms that ever rose upon the earth. To truly understand how the institution of the harem came to be, we must gently step back into the ancient world, into a time when kings and emperors first sought to surround themselves with women chosen for beauty, alliance, or lineage. The earliest shadows of the harem appeared in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, where powerful Assyrian and Babylonian kings ruled. In the palaces of these rulers, women were set apart in special quarters. They were not free to come and go as they pleased. Instead, they lived under the watchful eyes of guards and attendants, often eunuchs who could not pose a threat. Records inscribed in clay tablets tell us that these women were not merely companions, but also symbols of the king's wealth and dominion. To have many wives and concubines was to display abundance, and to house them in an organized, secluded space was to make clear that they belonged to the royal household alone. Already here, thousands of years ago, we see the outline of what later ages would call the harem, a world apart, sealed off from the outside, both protected and controlled. From Mesopotamia, the tradition flowed into Persia, the mighty empire of Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes. The Greeks, who encountered the Persians in battle and diplomacy, wrote in fascination about the luxurious women's quarters of the great kings. They describe palaces where wives, daughters, and concubines were kept in splendid isolation, tended to by servants, and surrounded by gardens and music. For the Persians, as for the Assyrians, the harem was more than indulgence. It was a political tool. Noble families sent their daughters to the court as a way to secure alliances, and the king's choice of favored consort could ripple through the empire, changing fortunes and shifting power. Though we see these accounts through the eyes of foreign writers, who sometimes exaggerated for effect, there is little doubt that by the time of the rise of Cyrus, the harem had become a formalized institution, an expected part of royal life, as essential as the throne room or the treasury. Centuries later, with the rise of Islam, the old traditions of seclusion took on a new meaning. The word harem itself comes from the Arabic root haram, meaning forbidden or sacred. It signified a space that was protected, not to be entered by outsiders, reserved for women of the household. In the early centuries, after the Prophet Muhammad, Muslim rulers, especially those of the Umayyad dynasty, began to adapt older Persian and Byzantine models of the women's quarters. By the time of the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in magnificent city of Baghdad, the harem had grown into a vast and powerful institution. The Abbasid caliphs kept harems that numbered in thousands, guarded by eunuchs, filled with wives, concubines, and female slaves from across the empire. These women were not only companions, but also mothers of princesses. Thus, they were at the heart of succession politics. The fate of dynasties sometimes turned on the rivalries and intrigues within the harems. It was from this world that the Ottomans inherited and perfected the harem system. Drawing from centuries of Middle Eastern practice, they established in their palaces a harem that was at once a sanctuary, a school, and a crucible for power. While the Ottomans would make the harem famous across the world, it is important to remember that they did not invent it. Rather, they took an ancient institution shaped by Mesopotamia, Persia, and the caliphates, and raised it to its most dazzling form. Thus, the harem was not born suddenly, nor was it the creation of a single king or empire. It evolved slowly, layer upon layer, across time and culture. From the clay tablets of Assyria, to the palaces of Persia, to the marble courts of Baghdad, the idea of secluding royal women and of concentrating beauty, alliance, and lineage within garden walls became a pattern repeated across civilizations. By the time the Ottoman sultans brought their empire to its height, the harem was already a familiar institution, heavy with history and tradition, yet still capable of new life and new meaning. The word harem often carries a cloud of mystery. colored by centuries of travelers' tales, legends, and later, Orientalist imagination. But to understand the true meaning, we must gently peel away those layers and look at what the harem actually was and what it was not. At its simplest, the harem was the private living quarters of the women in a royal or noble household. The very word comes from the Arabic root haram, meaning sacred, forbidden, or protected. It described a place that was set apart, reserved, not to be entered by just anyone. In everyday households, this might mean the inner rooms where wives and daughters lived, shielded from the eyes of strangers. In royal palaces, however, the harem grew into something far grander, an entire world behind walls, a city within a city, filled with wives, concubines, mothers, sisters, children, servants, and guardians. The harem was never merely a place of indulgence, as some imagined. It was, above all, about seclusion and control. In societies where female modesty was highly valued, the harem became the ultimate symbol of keeping women apart from the public eye. Only a select few men were allowed within its gates. The ruler himself, his young sons, and eunuchs who served as guards and attendants. To enter without permission was unthinkable. For outsiders, the harem was shrouded in secrecy, its inner life hidden behind screens and latticed windows. That very secrecy made it fertile ground for rumor, fascination, and exaggeration. Yet within its walls, the harem was not only a prison, but also a home. The women of the harem formed a community with its own rhythms and traditions. There were hierarchies to be observed, with senior women commanding respect and newcomers finding their place. The most powerful figure was often the ruler's mother, known in the Ottoman Empire as the Valide Sultan, who could act almost as a queen regent, guiding her son and managing balance affairs. Around her were the wives, concubines, and princesses, each with their own rank, privileges, and apartments. Below them were the attendants, female slaves who served in many roles, as chambermaids, musicians, seamstresses, or tutors. To imagine a harem is to picture both splendor and restriction. On one hand, the rooms were filled with silken cushions, carpets, perfumes, and jewels, all meant to please the eye and soothe the senses. Women wore robes of fine fabric, and music and poetry were often heard in the evenings. On the other hand, the walls and gates were unyielding. For most women inside, the harem was the beginning and end of their world. They might live their entire lives without walking the streets beyond the palace, freedom, in the modern sense, was not theirs to claim. It is important to remember that not all women in the harem were there by choice. Many were brought as captives of war or purchased in slave markets. Others were sent by noble families, sometimes willingly, sometimes reluctantly, as part of political alliances. To be chosen for the harem could mean a life of luxury, but it could also mean the loss of family and freedom. For some, it was both at once. And yet, the harem was not merely without opportunity, because it was a place where the ruler's attention could raise a woman from obscurity to prominence. It became a site for ambition and strategy. A concubine who bore a son, especially if that son lived to adulthood, could see her fortunes transformed overnight. From a foreign slave, she might rise to be the mother of a future ruler, her voice carrying weight in matters of empire. Many of the most powerful women in history began their journeys within the confines of a harem. Still, for most women, the harem was a quieter space, a school of etiquette, artistry, and survival. Girls were taught music, poetry, embroidery, and manners, skills meant to refine them for courtly life. Friendships formed, rivalries simmered, and life went on, day after day, behind the curtain of secrecy. In this way, the harem was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the sense that it was simply a household with meals, lessons, and chores. Extraordinary because the household belonged to a king, an emperor, or a sultan, and thus every gesture carried a weight of power. When outsiders, especially European travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries, tried to imagine the harem, they often misunderstood it. Cut off from seeing the reality, they wove fantastical tales of endless pleasure gardens, where rulers reclined among hundreds of women. These stories grew into myths that survive even today, making the harem seem like a place of constant sensuality. The truth was far more complex. While beauty and intimacy were part of the story, they were never the whole. Politics, education, culture, and survival were just as present within those walls. So, when we ask, what is the harem? We must hold both truth in our minds. It was at once a cage and a court, a place of confinement and a stage of influence. For some women, it was a golden prison from which they longed to escape. For others, it was the very path that led them to power, artistry, or remembrance in history. And for countless others, it was simply life, their everyday world, with its small joys, quiet routines, and inevitable sorrows. In the end, the harem was not just a place. It was an idea, a reflection of how societies understood women, family, and power. It was about protection, but also about control. It was about beauty, but also about politics. And above all, it was about the unseen, the hidden lives that shaped empires, not from the throne room, but from behind the curtain. When people hear the word harem, more often than not, their thoughts drift immediately to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman harem, housed within the sprawling Topkapi Palace of Istanbul, was not only the most famous of its kind, it became the very image that the world carried of this institution. For centuries, travelers, diplomats, and storytellers whispered tales of its hidden chambers, its jeweled women, and its political mysteries. Though some of these tales were exaggerated, the truth of the Ottoman harem is no less fascinating. It was at once a gilded prison, a center of education, and one of the most powerful political engines in the empire. The heart of the harem was the Topkapi Palace, a complex of courtyards, halls, gardens, and chambers overlooking the Bosporus. Within its walls, behind heavy doors and high barriers, the harem was carefully organized into layers of seclusion. Ordinary servants and concubines lived in one part, while women who had earned higher rank, favorites of the sultan, mothers of princess, or trusted attendants, resided closer to the sultan's private quarters. At the very center of this hierarchy stood the most formidable woman in the empire, the Valida Sultan, or Queen Mother, who wielded power second only to her son. She was the true matriarch of the harem, and often of the empire itself. The women who entered the harem came from many lands. Most were enslaved, captured during wars, or purchased from markets across Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and beyond. Many came from places like Circassia, Georgia, or Ukraine, regions famed for their beauty in the eyes of Ottoman elites. These girls were not free to choose their fate. Torn from their homes, they arrive in Istanbul as outsiders, unsure of the language, the customs, or the rules of their new lives. Yet within the walls of the harem, they enter a world both frightening and full of possibility. Life in the harem was not idleness. The women were taught skills: sewing, embroidery, music, dance, poetry, and the recitation of prayers. They were trained to carry themselves with elegance, to speak with refinement, and to serve the sultan if called upon. Those who proved especially talented or intelligent might rise to higher positions, from servant to concubine to favorite, and in rare cases to consort or queen mother. But every step up the ladder came with its own risks, for rivalry was fierce, and the sultan's favor could shift in an instant. It is tempting to imagine the harem as a place only of leisure, silken cushions, and scented baths. But the reality was far harsher. The harem was a cage of luxury. Once inside, few women ever left. They were cut off from the outside world, surrounded always by guards and attendants. Even their movements within the palace were carefully monitored. Yet within that gilded cage, women found ways to survive and even to rule. Indeed, some of the most famous women in Ottoman history rose from the harem. Consider Harem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxilana. Originally from what is now Ukraine, she was enslaved and brought to Istanbul as a young woman. Her charm, wit, and intelligence caught the eye of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, one of the most powerful rulers in Ottoman history. Against all traditions, Suleiman not only made her his favorite, but also his legal wife, a rare honor for a woman of enslaved origin. Harem bore him sons, advised him on matters of state, and corresponded with kings and queens across Europe. Through her, the harem's influence extended far beyond its walls, shaping diplomacy, policy, and even war. Another towering figure was Kösem Sultan, who entered the harem as a Greek slave girl, but rose to become one of the most powerful women the empire had ever known. As Valide Sultan, she effectively ruled the empire during the minority of her sons and grandsons. For decades, she held sway over the court, balancing factions, guiding sultans, and even deciding matters of succession. Her reign, though marked by intrigue and danger, revealed just how potent the political power of the harem could be. These stories of Harem and Kösem were not isolated. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, historians often speak of the Sultanate of Women, a period when mothers, wives, and favorites from the harem played decisive roles in the empire. While the Sultan held the throne, the women behind the curtain shaped his decisions, whispered counsel, and sometimes orchestrated the empire's course. In a world where women were formally excluded from politics, the harem became a back channel of enormous influence. But the harem was also a place of danger. Rivalries could turn deadly, since succession in the Ottoman Empire often led to fratricide, where brothers killed one another to secure the throne. The mothers of princes lived with constant fear. The rise of one woman's son meant the possible death of another's. Intrigues, poisons, and sudden falls from favor were not uncommon. To survive in the harem required intelligence, caution, and the ability to read the shifting winds of power. For outsiders, the harem became the subject of endless fascination. European travelers wrote accounts, sometimes fanciful, of what they imagined happened behind the walls. Painters conjured exotic scenes of odalisques reclining on divans, surrounded by incense and musicians. These depictions often said more about European fantasies than Ottoman realities. Yet, they helped cement the harem's image in the Western imagination. The truth that the harem was both a prison and a palace, both a place of despair and of power, was far more complex. The architecture of the harem itself reflected this duality. The Topkapi harem was a maze of corridors and chambers, some grandly decorated with tiles and fountains, others plain and restrictive. Light filtered in through lattice windows, casting patterns of shadows and brightness. The women lived in constant proximity to one another, yet each chamber also carried its own aura of isolation. Behind the beauty of the palace lay a rigid system designed to control, to protect the dynasty, and to ensure that the Sultan's household remained sealed from intrusion. As centuries passed, the Ottoman harem remained a symbol of power. Yet it also evolved. By the 19th century, reformers began to change the empire, and the harem too entered a period of decline. The days when women like Harem or Kosim could dominate politics gave way to a more symbolic role. Still, the legend of the Ottoman harem endured, becoming a subject of fascination for historians, artists, and storytellers alike. In the end, the Ottoman harem was many things at once. It was a place of sorrow for those torn from their homelands. It was a place of danger for those caught in intrigue. It was also a place of possibility, where women could rise from slavery to queenship, where mothers could build more influence than ministers, and where the future of the empire was often decided, not in the throne room, but in the chambers of the harem. This layered, paradoxical legacy is why the Ottoman harem remains the most famous, and perhaps the most haunting example of its kind in history. While the Ottoman harem may be the most famous in the Western imagination, it was by no means unique. Across the great civilizations of history, China, India, Persia, and the Mughal courts, women's quarters flourished in different forms, each with its own traditions, purposes, and peculiarities. By slowing our gaze and drifting gently across continents, we can see how the idea of harem, secluded women in royal households, was shaped by culture, politics, and the desires of those who ruled. Long before the rise of the Ottomans, the emperors of China presided over harems of staggering size and formality. In the palaces of the Han, Tang, and Ming dynasties, the emperor's household was carefully structured into ranks. At the center was the empress, the mother of the heir, revered as the mother of the nation. Surrounding her were concubines of varying status, noble ladies offered by powerful families, and young women selected for beauty, talent, or fortune. At its peak, the harem of a Chinese emperor could number in the thousands, more like a city within a palace than a single household. Life in the Chinese harem was highly ritualized. Women were trained in etiquette, calligraphy, poetry, and music. Their days were governed by ceremonies and courtly duties. At night, elaborate systems decided which woman might be summoned to the emperor's chambers, sometimes through a ritual as precise as rolling dice or presenting wooden tablets with names. But this privilege was not simply for pleasure. The emperor's offspring determined succession, and the women who bore sons stood to gain immense influence. Some, like Empress Wu Ziqian of the Tang dynasty, rose far beyond expectation. Wu began as a low-ranking concubine, but through intelligence, political skill, and relentless ambition, she rose step by step until she became the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. Her story shows how the harem could be both a cage and a ladder, limiting countless women while granting rare individuals a path to absolute power. In India, the women's quarters were known as the zenana, derived from Persian and later adopted in Mughal courts. Like the Ottoman harem, the zenana was a secluded and guarded world, reserved for wives, concubines, female relatives, and their attendants. Entry was forbidden to most men, with only eunuchs, trusted servants, or the ruler himself allowed inside. The zenana was not just a place of repose. It was a hub of cultural refinement. Women of the Mughal zenana were taught the arts, encouraged to patronize poets, and sometimes became artists or calligraphers themselves. No Dun, the empress and wife of Jahangir, was one of the most famous figures of the Mughal zenana. Her wisdom, taste, and strengths of will allowed her to rule beside her husband, issue imperial decrees, and commission magnificent gardens and palaces that still stand today. She transformed the zenana from a secluded chamber into a seat of influence. Yet, not every life in the zenana was so fortunate. Many women, especially those of lower rank, lived out their years in obscurity, rarely seen by the outside world. They were prized for their beauty or talents, yet forgotten one's age or illness claimed them. This contrast between the glittering power of women like Noor Jahan and the silence of countless others was a recurring theme in harems worldwide. In Persia, the Safavid and later Kahar dynasties maintained harems that combined splendor and severity. Like their Ottoman neighbors, Persian shahs collected wives and concubines from across their realms. The Persian harem was famed for its elegance, with gardens, mirrored halls, and luxurious baths. Women adorned themselves in silks and jewels, their beauty immortalized in Persian miniature paintings that survive to this day. But behind the artful depictions lay stories of rivalry and survival. Concubines vied for favor, knowing that the Shah's affection could elevate them and their children above all others. The Queen Mother held authority over the harem's management, mirroring the Valida Sultan of the Ottomans. Eunuchs guarded the gates, ensuring that no outsider could intrude. European visitors to Persia often marveled at the seclusion of these women, sometimes embellishing their accounts with fantasies of romance and excess. In reality, the Persian harem was a place of strict order, where women were trained to maintain grace and obedience, and her politics seeped in quietly through whispers, alliances, and the rise of favored consorts. Among the Mughals, who ruled a vast empire from the 16th to the 19th century, the harem became a symbol of imperial might. The Mughal emperors maintained enormous harems, sometimes numbering in the thousands. Within the high walls of the Red Fort in Delhi, or the palaces of Agra, women lived lives at once secluded and privileged. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Mughal harem was its role in diplomacy. Noble families often sent their daughters to the emperor's household, cementing alliances through marriage or concubinage. The emperor's choice of partner could shift the balance of politics in the realm. Moreover, Mughal women were not always silent figures. Empresses like Mumtaz Mahal, beloved wife of Shah Jahan, left enduring legacies. Her early death in childbirth inspired the construction of the Taj Mahal, one of the most beautiful monuments in the world. Though she lived in seclusion, her memory became eternal, carved in white marble that still draws millions of visitors today. The Mughal harem also had a softer side. It was a place of gardens, music, and poetry, where women gathered to enjoy festivals, play games, or listen to storytellers. Though confined, they were surrounded by refinement and culture, shaping tastes that influenced the empire's art and architecture. Though the harems of China, Persia, India, and the Mughals differed in detail, they shared certain patterns. Women lived in guarded quarters, separated from most men. Their fates were often tied to their beauty, their ability to bear sons, or their skill in winning favor. Rivalries were sharp, but the rewards for success could be immense, sometimes leading to wealth, influence, or even queenship. At the same time, these harems were paradoxical spaces, gilded prisons for most, but also schools of culture and refinement. For some women, they were cages that stifled freedom. For a rare few, they became the very path to power. The harem whether in Istanbul, Isfahan, Delhi, or Beijing, did not simply gather women by chance. Entry into the secluded world was carefully managed, often shaped by politics, conquest, and deeply ingrained cultural expectations. To understand the harem fully, we must look closely at the question of how these women were chosen and what kind of training prepared them for the life that awaited inside. For many women, the road into the harem began not with choice, but with circumstance. In the Ottoman Empire, the majority of concubines were not born into privilege. They were slaves, acquired through raids, tribute, or purchase in markets that stretched from the shores of the Black Sea to the bazaars of Cairo. Young women from Eastern Europe, Circassians, Georgians, and Ukrainians were especially prized for their beauty, which had become almost a cultural obsession among Ottoman elites. In China, selection often took the form of a state ritual. Officials scoured the provinces for girls of noble or promising background. Families sometimes sent their daughters willingly, hoping that service in the imperial harem might elevate their clan. Periodic selections, known as talent scouting, brought hundreds of girls to the Forbidden City, where they were carefully examined for appearance, health, and demeanor. Those chosen entered the harem, while others returned home, sometimes in shame, sometimes in relief. In Mughal India, the path could be diplomatic. Noble families might send their daughters as part of alliances, strengthening ties to the emperor. At other times, capture in war or incorporation of conquered peoples swell the ranks of the harem. Around cultures, the theme was consistent. Entry into the harem was rarely a matter of personal choice, but rather the product of politics, conquest, or the ambitions of families and rulers. What then made a girl suitable for the harem? Beauty, of course, was prized. Clear skin, bright eyes, delicate features, graceful bearing. But beauty alone was not enough. Intelligence, quickness of learning, and the ability to charm were equally valued. In societies where the ruler's household reflected the prestige of the throne, every woman chosen was expected to contribute to the refinement and grandeur of the court. In the Ottoman harem, for instance, new arrivals were assessed not only for appearance, but for potential usefulness. Could she sing? Could she embroider fine garments? Did she have a talent for poetry, or a calm and soothing presence that might please the Sultan? Similarly, in China, girls who could master poetry or calligraphy often rose above rivals, for culture and elegance were signs of refinement, worthy of an emperor's household. Once inside, training began almost immediately. The harem was a world with its own laws, customs, and etiquette, and newcomers had to be molded to fit. In the Ottoman harem, girls were first placed under the care of older attendants who instructed them in language, manners, and the rhythm of palace life. They learned to walk gracefully, to bow at the right times, to dress in silks and jewels with elegance. Lessons in music, dance, embroidery, and storytelling filled their days. Some were taught to recite the Quran with perfect intonation, preparing them for moments of ritual or prayer. In China's Forbidden City, training was equally rigorous. Concubines in waiting were schooled in Confucian virtues: obedience, humility, respect for hierarchy. They memorized rituals, learned to serve tea with precision, in practice the art of presenting themselves before the emperor. Discipline was strict. A careless word, a stumble in etiquette, could mean demotion or dismissal. The Mughal Sanana placed special emphasis on the arts. Women painted, embroidered, and patronized poets. Some became skilled musicians or writers in their own right. Education was not only a means of refinement, but also a subtle way to influence culture beyond the walls of seclusion. The training of harem women was never simply about art or elegance. It was about discipline. The harem was structured like a miniature society, and everyone had a place within it. Obedience to superiors was paramount. In the Ottoman harem, for example, the Valide Sultan stood at the top, and beneath her, a ladder of ranks descended through favorites, consorts, and attendants, all the way down to the humblest servant. Every woman learned early where she stood and how far she might hope to climb. For many, training meant accepting the loss of freedom. Contact with the outside world was cut off. Letters, visits, even glimpses of family became rare or impossible. The walls of the harem were both shelter and barrier. Women were expected to adjust, to find meaning in service, in artistry, or in the hope of catching the ruler's notice. Alongside the lessons in music and poetry, there was always an unspoken training in survival. Women learned to observe quietly, to sense shifts in favor, to navigate rivalries. A smile in the wrong direction, a whispered rumor, a poorly timed remark could bring ruin. The more ambitious studied the art of intrigue, forging alliances, cultivating protectors, and preparing for the day when fortune might smile or turn suddenly cold. For every Hurrem Sultan who rose from slavery to queenship, there were hundreds who lived in obscurity, their names lost to history. Training prepared them not only for the possibility of greatness, but also for the likelihood of anonymity. In this way, the harem functioned both as a school and a cage. It refined women into paragons of elegance and culture, but it also bound them into a life of control and limitation. The selection process stripped them of choice, and training reshaped them to fit the expectations of rulers. For some, This became a pathway to influence, wealth, or even legendary power. For most, it was a quiet fate, lived in shadows, shaped by rituals and bounded by walls. Across cultures and centuries, the story repeats. The harem was filled with women, chosen not for what they wanted, but for what rulers and dynasties required. And once chosen, their lives unfolded within a carefully constructed system, one that blended artistry and obedience, culture and refinement, promise and peril. To the outside world, the harem often shimmered like a dream. In paintings, stories, and whispered tales, it was imagined as a palace of delights, where women reclined on silken cushions, surrounded by music, perfume, and luxury. But for the women who lived behind those walls, life was rarely so simple. Beneath the glitter lay difficulties, both visible and hidden. Challenges of survival, identity, and power. The harem was not only a place of privilege, but also one of confinement, rivalry, and uncertainty. The first and most universal challenge was isolation. To live in the harem was to be cut off from the outside world. Once a woman enters its gates, she left behind family, homeland, and the possibility of ordinary life. For some, especially those who had been captured or sold into slavery, the loss was profound. Imagine being taken from the mountains of Georgia or the plains of Ukraine, from a small village in Persia or a noble family in China, and finding yourself suddenly walled into a palace where the language was strange, the customs unfamiliar, and escape impossible. Though the harem could be filled with gardens and fountains, the walls were always there, a reminder of separation. Another challenge came from within, the competition for favor. In every harem, from the Ottoman Topkapi to the Chinese Forbidden City, women were ranked according to status. Some were lowly servants. Others favored concubines. A rare few, queens or empresses. To climb the ladder meant better food, finer clothing, more comfortable chambers, and most importantly, a chance to influence the ruler. But every step upward came at the expense of others. Rivalries could be fierce, especially over the birth of sons. In the Ottoman Empire, a woman who bore the Sultan a son might suddenly find herself elevated to high rank. But this triumph brought peril, for the survival of her child meant the possible death of another's. Brothers were often forced into deadly contests for the throne, and their mothers became locked in bitter struggles of intrigue and influence. The atmosphere of suspicion was constant. Whispers, rumors, and accusations drifted through the harem like shadows. A single mistake, or the envy of a rival could bring disgrace or even death. For every woman who mastered the art of court intrigue, many more fell victim to it. Life in the harem was governed by strict rules. Disobedience, disrespect, or suspected betrayal could bring swift punishment. In the Ottoman harem, women might be demoted, beaten, or banished to distant parts of the palace, where they lived in obscurity. In some cases, they could even be executed, especially if accused of treasonous plots. Chinese history tells similar tales. Concubines who angered the emperor or his empress risked demotion to menial service, or in extreme cases, forced death. The hierarchy was rigid, and discipline was enforced with unyielding precision. The knowledge that one's fate rested entirely in the hands of the ruler or the queen mother was a heavy weight to bear. Perhaps the most painful challenge of all was the role of mothers in the politics of succession. In the Ottoman Empire, the system of fratricide meant that when a new sultan took the throne, his brothers might be executed to secure his rule. This practice, while meant to prevent civil war, cast a dark shadow over the harem. For mothers, it meant living with the knowledge that their sons' lives hung in constant danger. Imagine the dread of a concubine whose child was not chosen as heir. To know that your son, a boy you had raised with love, could be strangled with a silken cord at the order of his brother was a torment beyond words. Even when the practice softened into imprisonment rather than execution, the fear remained. Mothers lived with sleepless nights, torn between ambition and grief, caught in a system that demanded sacrifice for the stability of the empire. For every famous figure, every Hurrem Sultan, every Empress Wu, every Nur Jahan, there were countless women whose names we will never know. These women lived quiet lives in the shadow of history, never rising into prominence, never escaping the confines of their chambers. They served, embroidered, sang, or prayed, but left behind no legacy except perhaps a few lines in forgotten records. The challenge for these women was not rivalry or power, but endurance. Day after day, year after year, they remained in seclusion, growing older, watching new arrivals take their place. Their youth and beauty faded, and with it any chance of the ruler's favor. For them, the harem was not a path to greatness, but a place of slow disappearance. Taken together, these challenges show us the dual nature of the harem. It was both a palace of beauty and a prison of shadows. For a rare few, it offered opportunity, power, even the chance to shape history. For most, it was a world of longing, rivalry, and survival. The women of the harem lived suspended between extremes, pampered and yet imprisoned, adorned with silks and yet stripped of freedom, surrounded by splendor, and yet haunted by fear. Their stories remind us that behind the shimmering legends of harems live human lives, each carrying hopes and sorrows, joys and griefs. When people think of harems, they often imagine them as quiet sanctuaries hidden away from the wider world. Places where women lived in leisure, untouched by politics or affairs of state. But the truth was far more complex. For many empires, the harem was not only a domestic space, it was also a center of power, where decisions were influenced, alliances forged, and destinies shaped. Far from being silent and passive, the women within the harem often played subtle but decisive roles in the political life of their nations. Perhaps the most famous example of political power within the harem comes from the Ottoman Empire, particularly during the period known as the Sultanate of Women in the 16th and 17th centuries. During this era, women such as Hurrem Sultan, Kusum Sultan, and Torhan Sultan rose to remarkable influence, guiding state policy from behind the curtains of Topkapi Palace. These women were not merely companions to the Sultan. They were advisors, strategists, and sometimes even rulers in all but name. Hurrem, for example, convinced Sultan Mehmed the Magnificent to marry her, breaking with Ottoman custom. From that point, she became his confidant and exerted tremendous sway over decisions of war, diplomacy, and law. Kusum Sultan, later in the century, acted as regent for her young sons and effectively governed the empire during their minorities. Their power came not from official titles, but from access. In a world where proximity to the ruler determined influence, the women of the harem were closer to the Sultan than almost anyone else. A whispered word at night, a gentle suggestion at the right moment, could change the course of an empire. Ministers, generals, and foreign ambassadors understood this reality well, and many sought to curry favor with powerful harem women in order to secure their own political aims. China's Forbidden City offers another striking example. The imperial harem there was vast, with thousands of women, each carefully ranked. While most lived quietly in obscurity, some rose to astonishing heights of power. The most famous was Wu Zichen, who began as a concubine of Emperor Taizong, later became the favored consort of his son, Emperor Gaozong, and ultimately declared herself Empress of China. She reigned in her own right, the only woman in Chinese history to do so, and reshaped the Tang dynasty through reforms, patronage of Buddhism, and ruthless elimination of rivals. Wu's rise illustrates the harem's political potential. What began as a space designed to serve the emperor's private life became, in practice, a springboard for women who possessed intelligence, ambition, and courage. Through strategic maneuvering, alliances with court officials, and mastery of politics, women could seize power even in a male-dominated world. In Mughal India, the harem was also a hub of intrigue and influence. The Mughal emperors kept extensive harems, often numbering in the hundreds. While most women lived in seclusion, a few wielded real authority. Among them, none was more remarkable than Nur Jahan, the wife of Emperor Jahangir. Nur Jahan rose from being a widow in the imperial household to become the most powerful woman in the empire. She issued imperial decrees in her own name, had coins struck bearing her title, and influenced matters of state with confidence. Under her guidance, art, architecture, and poetry flourished, and her political instincts helped steady the empire during turbulent times. Her story reveals another layer of harem politics, the delicate balance between affection and authority. Nur Jahan was not only beloved by Jahangir, but also respected by courtiers who recognized her sharp intellect. In a system where most women were expected to remain silent, her voice carried across the empire. Of course, power in the harem was never secure. For every woman who rose to influence, there were countless others plotting to take her place. Intrigues were common, often involving alliances with eunuchs, courtiers, or even outside factions. Poisonings, secret messages, and sudden shifts in favor were part of harem life. In the Ottoman harem, for instance, rival mothers of princes often engaged in quiet wars, each hoping her son would be chosen as heir. These struggles could turn deadly, leading to plots of assassination or schemes to undermine opponents. Even the architecture of Tokapi reflected this tension. Different wings and apartments carefully separated women to prevent conspiracies, though such measures rarely succeeded. The Chinese court was no different. Historical records describe bitter rivalries among imperial concubines, some ending in disgrace or death. Another source of influence came from motherhood. In many empires, the mother of the ruler, whether titled Valida Sultan in the Ottoman world or Empress Dowager in China, was among the most powerful figures in the state. These women, having secured their position through the success of their sons, often acted as regents, advisors, and protectors of dynastic continuity. Their political role was immense. They controlled appointments, mediated disputes, and oversaw the harem itself. In some cases, their authority eclipsed that of ministers, making them the true power behind the throne. This phenomenon demonstrates how the harem, while often dismissed as a place of luxury, could in fact be the engine of governance. What emerges from all these examples is a picture of the harem as a web of influence. On its surface, it was a space of seclusion, a private world cut off from the affairs of men. But beneath that surface, it pulsed with politics. Women maneuvered carefully, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly, to shape events far beyond the palace walls. The harem was not just a cage, nor just a sanctuary. It was a stage where some of the most dramatic political plays unfolded. From Istanbul to Beijing, from Delhi to Isfahan, the women of the harem stood at the intersection of desire and power, of intimacy and authority. Their intrigues shaped dynasties, altered the course of wars, and left marks on the history that can still be traced today. The word harem steers images of confinement. Women hidden away behind high walls, separated from the world, watched over by guards and eunuchs. For centuries, outsiders often described it as a gilded prison, where beauty was locked away for the pleasure of rulers. Yet the reality was far more layered. To ask whether the harem was a cage or a place of learning is to open a window into its contradictions. It was both, and neither, depending on who lived within it, what ambitions they carried, and how fortune treated them. For many women, the harem did indeed feel like a cage. Entry into the harem meant the end of freedom in almost every sense. They could no longer choose where to live, whom to love, or what life to pursue. From the moment they entered, their movements were tightly controlled. Visits outside were rare, if allowed at all, and contact with men beyond the ruler and select eunuchs was strictly forbidden. This confinement was not just physical, but also social. A woman could not marry unless chosen by the sovereign, nor could she leave without permission. Even those who grew old in the harem often remained within its walls, living out their days in quiet isolation. In this sense, the harem resembled a cage of silks and jewels, a place where beauty was preserved, but liberty denied. The architecture itself reinforced this feeling. In Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, the harem was enclosed with thick walls, with labyrinthine corridors and carefully guarded gates. In Beijing's Forbidden City, concubines lived in separate compounds, arranged according to rank. Their lives regulated by court calendars and rituals. From dawn to dusk, their existence was scheduled, watched, and contained. For women who had once known freedom, especially those taken from distant lands as slaves, the sense of loss could be overwhelming. They remembered the open skies of their homelands, the laughter of families, and the simplicity of ordinary life. In the harem, that past faded into memory, replaced by rituals, obedience, and waiting. And yet, alongside this confinement, the harem could also be a place of remarkable education. Contrary to the image of idle women lounging in luxury, many harems were structured as schools of refinement, where women were trained in the arts, manners, and skills of courtly life. In the Ottoman harem, for example, young women were taught to read and write, to recite poetry, and to learn the Quran. They studied music, dance, embroidery, and calligraphy. Some were instructed in languages, especially if they came from foreign lands. The goal was not merely to amuse the ruler, but to shape women into cultured companions who could enhance the prestige of the court. Chinese harems functioned similarly. Concubines were expected to embody grace and intelligence, trained in literature, etiquette, and sometimes even politics. Empress Wu Zichun, who rose from concubinage to emperorship, was famed for her literary skills and mastery of Confucian classics. Without the education she received within the palace, her ascent would have been far more difficult. In Mughal India, too, the harem became a place where art and culture flourished. Women commissioned architecture, supported poets, and participated in the transition of knowledge. Nur Jahan, for instance, was celebrated not only for her political influence, but also for her patronage of gardens, textiles, and literature. For those who seized the opportunity, the harem could indeed be a kind of university, one reserved for women who might otherwise have been denied formal education in their societies. It was a paradox, imprisonment that sometimes opened doors to learning. Education within the harem was often overseen by eunuchs or specialized tutors. Eunuchs who lived in close proximity to the women acted not only as guards, but also as mediators of knowledge and conduits of court culture. They ensured that rulers were followed, but the women were trained according to their rank and role. In some empires, older women who had once been favored but were now retired from the ruler's attention took on the role of teachers. They passed on the subtleties of etiquette, the art of conversation, and the strategies of survival. Through this informal mentorship, younger women learned how to navigate the dangers and opportunities of harem life. The truth is that the harem was never entirely one thing. For some women, it was undeniably a cage, a place where their lives withered away behind guarded walls. For others, it was a school that opened paths to influence, even greatness. The difference often lay in fortune, whether the ruler noticed them, whether they bore children, whether they mastered the art of intrigue. But even for the most educated and influential, the shadow of the cage remained. No matter how skilled or powerful a woman became, she was still bound to the system, still defined by her relationship to the ruler. The harem's promise of learning never erased its fundamental structure of confinement. To modernize, this duality can seem baffling. How could a place be both prison and academy? But for the women who lived it, the paradox was daily reality. They dressed in silks, yet walked only within courtyards. They read poetry and played music, yet dreamed of the freedom to leave. They learned politics and strategy, yet wielded influence only so long as the ruler permitted. The harem was a world where splendor and restriction lived side by side. To call it only a cage would ignore the culture and learning it fostered. To call it only a place of education would erase the pain of those who longed for freedom. It was both, and neither, a mirror of the contradictions of power itself. Every institution, no matter how powerful or deeply rooted, eventually meets its end. The harem, which had for centuries been at the heart of royal courts from Istanbul to Beijing, from Delhi to Isfahan, was no exception. Its decline was gradual, shaped by political change, modernization, and the shifting values of societies entering the modern era. What was once a symbol of power and exclusivity slowly unraveled, leaving behind both memories and myth. In the Ottoman Empire, the harem reached its peak during the age of Sultan Mehmed the Magnificent and the period of the Sultanate of Women. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, its influence began to wane. The empire itself was weakening, pressured by European powers, and struggling with internal decay. As sultans lost authority, so too did their harems. By the 19th century, reforms known as the Tanzimat sought to modernize Ottoman institutions. Western ideas about governance, women's strollers, and education began to spread, challenging the older systems of seclusion. The harem, once the private domain of the Sultan, was increasingly seen as outdated. Some women of the harem were educated in European languages, traveled abroad, or corresponded with Western visitors, blending the old traditions with new influences. The final blow came with the abolition of the Ottoman Sultanate in the early 20th century. When the Turkish Republic was founded in 1923 under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the royal household was dissolved. The harem at Tokali Palace was emptied, its women dispersed, its rooms left as silent relics of a vanished age. What had once been a living institution became a museum, its echoes preserved in tile and marble. In China, the imperial harem of the Forbidden City endured for centuries, with thousands of concubines serving dynasties from the Ming to the Qing. Yet, by the 19th century, the Qing dynasty was crumbling under internal rebellion, foreign invasion, and the weight of its own rigid traditions. The last great figure of the Chinese harem was Empress Dowager Cixi, who, like Wu Zetian before her, wielded extraordinary power from behind the throne. She dominated court politics for nearly half a century, but her reign was marked by turmoil, and by the early 20th century, the dynasty was on the verge of collapse. When the Qing dynasty finally fell in 1911, the harem as an institution fell with it. The young Emperor Puyi, though briefly restored to his palace, no longer ruled a functioning empire. His concubines and royal women found themselves relics of a bygone era, their lives uprooted by revolution. The Forbidden City itself was transformed, like Topkapi, into a museum, its halls no longer echoing with the whispers of court intrigue. In Mughal India, the harem was once an opulent institution filled with artistry, poetry, and influence. But by the 18th century, the Mughal Empire was in steep decline. Regional rulers and foreign invaders chipped away at its power, while the British East India Company gained control of the subcontinent. The harems of the later Mughals were smaller, poorer, and less influential. By the time the British established full colonial rule, the institution had withered into obscurity. Some royal women were granted pensions. Others slipped quietly into private lives. The harem, once a glittering jewel of the Mughal court, became a shadow of its former self, remembered only in chronicles, poetry, and architecture. In Persia, harems remained central to Safavid and Qajar dynasties well into the 19th century. But as Western influence grew and modernization swept across Iran, the institution came under scrutiny. By the early 20th century, the Pahlavi dynasty introduced reforms that sought to limit seclusion and promote women's public roles. The traditional harem, once so firmly tied to kingship, gradually disappeared. What linked all these declines was modernization. As empires encountered industrialization, nationalism, and Western political ideals, the harems seemed increasingly archaic. Ideas of individual freedom, women's education, and new forms of marriage challenged the very foundations of the system. Where once the harem symbolized luxury and control, it now appeared as a relic of despotism. Western colonizers often mocked harems as proof of Eastern backwardness, using the institution to justify their own dominance. Reformers within these societies, eager to prove their modernity, also turned against the harem, advocating for new roles for women outside the palace walls. Though harems' institutions ended, their legacy persisted. The women who had once lived in them carried their stories into their new lives, though few of those stories were recorded in detail. Palaces remained, their harem quarters preserved as museums, inviting visitors to imagine the lives that once unfolded there. In popular culture, the harem never truly disappeared. It survived in novels, paintings, films, and fantasies, reimagined again and again. In this way, the decline of the actual harem gave rise to the rise of the mythic harem, an idea that lived longer than the institution itself. The end of Rome's did not come with dramatic violence or sudden destruction. Instead, it was more like the quiet closing of gates. One by one, dynasties fell. Palaces were emptied, and the voices of women who had once filled those halls faded into silence. What had been a vibrant, if complicated, world became history, remembered in records and stories, preserved in stone and tile. The decline of the harem reminds us that even the most enduring traditions change with time. Institutions that once seemed eternal can vanish in a generation, leaving behind only memory. And in that memory, the harem remains, a world of beauty and sorrow, influence and confinement, splendor and silence, finally yielding to the currents of history. The story of the harem is not only about palaces and power. It is about people. Behind the jeweled screens and marble walls lived women and men whose lives were shaped by love, ambition, fear, and hope. Some found influence, becoming mothers of rulers or advisors who guided empires. Others lived quietly, their names forgotten, their stories lost in the silence of history. Today, the harem survives not as an institution, but as an idea. Museums display its rooms. Novels and films imagine its intrigues, and scholars debate its meaning. Was it a prison, keeping women in gilded cages? Or was it a place of learning and resilience, where women carved out authority in a male-dominated world? The truth lies somewhere in between. What is certain is that the harem reveals the fragility of power. For all its wealth and grandeur, it depended on the will of rulers and the shifting tides of history. And like every empire, it faded. What remains are echoes, whispers of laughter, of rivalry, of footsteps along tiled corridors, reminding us that behind the myth were real human lives. As you drift into sleep, perhaps the harem can be remembered not only as a symbol of desire or control, but as a reminder of how history holds both beauty and sorrow, and how every life, no matter how hidden, contributes to the great story of humanity.